Ozzy Osbourne walked through the golden gates of Buckingham Palace in 1982 when Queen Elizabeth looked out from her window and commanded, "Stop this nonsense immediately." No one could have known at that moment that the encounter between this strange-looking rock star and the British monarchy would completely change both the palace's and Ozzy's lives forever. Because sometimes the most unlikely meetings create the most extraordinary stories. The autumn morning of November 15th, 1982, found Queen Elizabeth II reviewing the list of candidates for the upcoming knighthood ceremony. As she sat in her private study overlooking the palace gardens, the morning light filtering through ancient windows, she paused at one particular name that had been causing considerable discussion among palace staff for weeks. John Michael Osborne, known to the world as Ozzy Osbourne, was being considered for recognition of his contributions to British music and culture. Black Sabbath had revolutionized rock music, and Ozzy's solo career was reaching unprecedented heights. His album Blizzard of Oz had not only dominated charts worldwide, but had also brought a distinctly British sound to international audiences, making him one of the country's most successful musical exports. But as Queen Elizabeth studied the accompanying photographs and press clippings, her expression grew increasingly concerned. Here was a man who seemed to embody everything that traditional British values stood against. The images showed long, unkempt hair reaching his shoulders, dark clothing that appeared deliberately disheveled, and jewelry that seemed more appropriate for a medieval warrior than a modern gentleman. The press reports spoke of controversial performances, bizarre stage antics, and behavior that had scandalized conservative audiences across the globe. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the palace's chief protocol officer, stood beside the Queen's desk with a thick folder containing additional documentation about the proposed honor. Lady Catherine had served the royal household for over 20 years, and her devotion to maintaining the dignity and traditions of the monarchy was absolute. She had been the one to raise the most serious objections to Ozzy's inclusion on the honors list. "Your Majesty," Lady Catherine said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that came with decades of palace service, "I must reiterate my concerns about Mr. Osborne's suitability for this honor. His public behavior, his image, and frankly the type of music he represents seem fundamentally incompatible with the values we seek to promote." The Queen set down the photographs and looked directly at her protocol officer. Queen Elizabeth had spent 3 decades on the throne, navigating the changing social landscape of Britain while maintaining the monarchy's relevance and dignity. She had seen the country transform dramatically since her coronation, from the conservative 1950s through the revolutionary 1960s and into the complex 19th. Each era had brought new challenges to traditional institutions, and she had learned to adapt while preserving essential principles. "Tell me more about your specific concerns, Catherine," the Queen said, her tone neutral but attentive. Lady Catherine opened her folder and began reading from her carefully prepared notes. "Mr. Osborne's stage performances have included biting the heads off live animals, simulating violent acts, and promoting imagery associated with devil worship. His lyrics often contain profanity and references to death, darkness, and rebellion against authority. The conservative press has labeled him a corrupting influence on British youth," she continued, warming to her subject. "More importantly, Your Majesty, his appearance and behavior would send entirely the wrong message about British culture to the international community. Can we really afford to associate the crown with someone who represents chaos and rebellion?" The Queen nodded thoughtfully as she listened to these concerns. The weight of tradition pressed heavily in moments like these. The honors system had been carefully designed to recognize excellence while maintaining certain standards of conduct and presentation. Every recipient became, in some sense, a representative of British values and achievements. "And what do his supporters say?" the Queen asked, demonstrating the balanced approach that had served her well throughout her reign. "Well," Lady Catherine admitted reluctantly, "the music industry argues that he has been instrumental in establishing Britain as a global leader in rock music. They point to his influence on countless musicians worldwide and his role in creating an entirely new genre. Some economists have noted the substantial foreign revenue generated by his tours and record sales." The Queen walked to her window and gazed out at the palace grounds, where centuries of British history had unfolded. She thought about the changing nature of cultural influence and the challenge of remaining relevant to newer generations while preserving timeless values. "There's also," Lady Catherine continued, "considerable public support for his recognition. Polls suggest that younger Britons overwhelmingly view him as a positive representative of British creativity and independence." After several minutes of silent contemplation, Queen Elizabeth made her decision: arrange for Mr. Osborne to visit the palace for a private audience before any final determination is made. I believe it's important to meet someone personally before making judgments about their character. Lady Catherine's face betrayed her dismay. Your Majesty, surely that's unnecessary. The evidence of his unsuitability is quite clear from the public record. Nevertheless, the Queen replied with quiet authority, the meeting will be arranged. If we are to honor or decline to honor someone, we should at least extend them the courtesy of a personal encounter. The news that Ozzy Osbourne would be visiting Buckingham Palace sent shockwaves through the royal household. Palace staff, who had spent their careers maintaining the highest standards of protocol and presentation, found themselves preparing for a guest unlike any they had previously welcomed. Head butler James Morrison, who had served the royal family for 15 years, called an emergency meeting of senior staff to discuss proper procedures for the upcoming visit. The palace's elaborate protocol manual, which covered everything from the proper way to serve tea to foreign dignitaries to the correct forms of address for various nobility, contained no guidance for receiving a heavy metal rock star. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison addressed the assembled staff in the servants' hall. We find ourselves in uncharted territory. Mr. Osborne's visit must be conducted with the same professionalism and dignity we bring to every royal engagement, regardless of our personal opinions about the guest. The palace's head of security, Commander Patricia Wells, raised practical concerns about the visit. Sir, we've reviewed Mr. Osborne's public appearances, and there are certain unpredictable elements to consider. His behavior can be quite spontaneous, and we need to be prepared for various scenarios. Morrison nodded gravely. Indeed, however, Her Majesty has made her wishes clear. We shall treat Mr. Osborne with the same respect and attention we would show to any other guest. That means proper greeting, appropriate refreshments, and absolute discretion regarding anything that occurs during his visit. The kitchen staff expressed particular anxiety about the encounter. Royal Chef Henri Dubois, who had prepared meals for prime ministers and presidents, found himself researching what might be appropriate to serve someone whose dietary preferences were completely unknown to him. The palace's usual selection of delicate sandwiches, fine pastries, and carefully selected teas seemed potentially inadequate for someone whose public image suggested more robust tastes. Meanwhile, Lady Catherine worked frantically to establish some basic ground rules for the meeting. She prepared detailed briefing notes about proper palace etiquette, hoping to minimize the potential for embarrassing incidents. The guidelines covered everything from acceptable topics of conversation to appropriate physical behavior within the royal presence. On the appointed day, November 29, 1982, a modest black car pulled up to the palace's private entrance. Unlike the usual diplomatic vehicles or luxury automobiles that typically arrived for royal audiences, this car appeared ordinary, almost understated. Palace security had been discreetly reinforced, not out of concern for danger, but due to uncertainty about what to expect. When Ozzy Osbourne stepped out of the vehicle, the palace guards maintained their professional composure despite their surprise at his appearance. He wore his characteristic black clothing, not formal attire by palace standards, but clearly his best attempt at respectful dress. His long hair was neatly combed, and while he still wore his signature jewelry, he had obviously made an effort to present himself appropriately for the occasion. Butler Morrison met Ozzy at the entrance with the same formal courtesy extended to every palace visitor. Mr. Osborne, he said with a slight bow, Her Majesty is expecting you. If you would be so kind as to follow me. As they walked through the palace's magnificent corridors, past paintings of British monarchs spanning centuries and artifacts representing the breadth of the Commonwealth, Ozzy appeared genuinely awed by his surroundings. His usual confident stage presence seemed subdued, replaced by obvious respect for the historical significance of his location. These paintings, Ozzy said quietly to Morrison, they're incredible. How old are some of these? Morrison, who had expected the visit to be challenging, found himself pleasantly surprised by his guest's genuine interest and respectful demeanor. Many date back several centuries, sir. This particular corridor features portraits of monarchs from the House of Hanover. They paused before a massive painting of King George III, and Ozzy studied it with unexpected intensity. He was mad, wasn't he? King George? History suggests he suffered from a medical condition that affected his mental state. Yes, sir, Morrison replied diplomatically. That must have been difficult, Ozzy mused. Being in a position where everyone expects you to be perfect, but you're struggling with things you can't control. This comment struck Morrison as surprisingly insightful, revealing a depth of understanding he hadn't anticipated from someone whose public image suggested little interest in historical or psychological political complexity. Queen Elizabeth waited in her private sitting room, a more intimate space than the formal reception rooms typically used for official audiences. She had chosen this setting deliberately, hoping to create an atmosphere more conducive to genuine conversation than formal ceremony. When Morrison announced Ozzy's arrival, the Queen rose from her chair and extended her hand in greeting. This gesture immediately set a tone of mutual respect that surprised everyone present, including Ozzy himself, who had expected a much more formal and distant interaction. "Mr. Osbourne," the Queen said, "thank you for accepting my invitation. Please have a seat." Ozzy, clearly nervous but trying to maintain his composure, carefully took the offered chair. "Your Majesty, it's an incredible honor. I never imagined I'd be sitting in Buckingham Palace. I must confess," the Queen said with a slight smile, "I never imagined I'd be hosting a rock star either. But I've learned that many of life's most interesting moments come from unexpected encounters." Lady Catherine, who had positioned herself discreetly nearby, watched the interaction with barely concealed anxiety. She had prepared for numerous potential disasters, but found herself witnessing what appeared to be a perfectly civilized conversation between two people of vastly different backgrounds. "I understand there's been some discussion about recognizing your contributions to British music," the Queen continued. "I'm curious to hear your own perspective on your career and its impact." Ozzy shifted slightly in his chair, clearly considering his words carefully. "Well, Your Majesty, I know my music isn't for everyone. I've always been different. Even as a child, I struggled in school, had learning difficulties, and never fit in with traditional expectations." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "But music saved me. It gave me a way to express feelings I couldn't communicate otherwise. And I've learned that there are millions of people who feel the same way, lost, angry, confused, looking for something real in a world that often feels fake." The Queen listened intently, her expression revealing genuine interest, rather than the polite attention she might show during routine ceremonies. "I've never tried to corrupt anyone," Ozzy continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about something clearly close to his heart. "My music comes from real experiences: depression, addiction, feeling like an outsider. When young people connect with these songs, it's because they recognize their own struggles. Sometimes, music is the only thing that makes them feel less alone." "That's a profound responsibility," the Queen observed. "How do you handle the criticism that your music promotes negative values?" Ozzy's response surprised everyone in the room with its thoughtfulness. "I think about that constantly, Your Majesty. Every song, every performance. The darkness in my music isn't meant to celebrate evil. It's meant to acknowledge that darkness exists, and that acknowledging it is the first step toward dealing with it." He leaned forward slightly, his passion for the subject evident. "I've received thousands of letters from fans saying my music helped them through depression, helped them feel understood, sometimes even saved their lives. That's not something I take lightly." Queen Elizabeth found herself genuinely engaged by this perspective. Throughout her reign, she had met countless individuals who had made significant contributions to British society, but rarely had she encountered someone who spoke so honestly about reaching people who felt marginalized or forgotten. "Your approach to performance," she said, "the theatrical elements that have caused so much controversy, how do you view their purpose?" "Rock music has always been about breaking down barriers," Ozzy explained. "The shock, the spectacle, it's partly entertainment, but it's also about forcing people to question their assumptions. When someone is outraged by what I do on stage, I hope they also ask themselves why they're outraged, what they're really afraid of." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics ranging from the role of music in society to the challenges of maintaining authenticity while achieving commercial success. Lady Catherine watched in amazement as her sovereign engaged in what appeared to be a genuinely meaningful dialogue with someone she had dismissed as unsuitable for royal recognition. As the meeting drew to a close, Queen Elizabeth made a decision that would surprise even her closest advisors. "Mr. Osbourne," she said, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about your character and your contributions. Would you be willing to accept recognition for your services to British music?" Ozzy's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your Majesty, I'm honored beyond words. But are you certain? I know I'm not what people expect from someone who receives royal recognition." "Perhaps," the Queen replied. "That's exactly why such recognition is important. Britain's strength has always come from our diversity, our willingness to embrace different forms of excellence. You represent a tradition of British creativity and independence that deserves acknowledgement." News of Ozzy's impending knighthood leaked to the press within days, creating a media sensation that dominated British headlines for weeks, conservative commentators expressed outrage, liberal voices celebrated the decision, and the music industry hailed it as long overdue recognition of rock music's cultural significance. The Times ran an editorial titled, "The Monarchy's Bold Evolution," praising Queen Elizabeth's willingness to recognize changing cultural values while maintaining institutional dignity. The Daily Mail, predictably, condemned the decision as the end of standards, featuring interviews with shocked aristocrats and conservative politicians. But perhaps most significantly, young people across Britain responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. Record shops reported increased sales not only of Ozzy's music, but of British rock in general. Musicians who had previously felt excluded from mainstream recognition began to see new possibilities for acceptance and respect. Lady Catherine, despite her initial reservations, found herself grudgingly impressed by the positive response from younger Britons. Letters poured into the palace from young people expressing gratitude for the Queen's recognition of their musical preferences and cultural identity. The actual knighthood ceremony, held 3 months later, became one of the most watched royal events in years. Ozzy arrived, dressed in formal morning dress, his long hair neatly tied back, looking every inch the gentleman despite his unconventional background. As Queen Elizabeth touched the ceremonial sword to his shoulders, she spoke the traditional words, "Rise, Sir John Michael Osbourne." The moment was captured by photographers and broadcast worldwide, symbolizing a new chapter in the relationship between traditional institutions and contemporary culture. In his brief acceptance speech, Sir Ozzy spoke movingly about the importance of the recognition, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt like an outsider. "This honor belongs to every kid who's ever been told they don't fit in, every musician who's been told their music doesn't matter, everyone who's been different and proud of it." The Ozzy Osbourne knighthood became a watershed moment in British cultural history, representing the monarchy's successful adaptation to changing social values, without abandoning its essential dignity and purpose. Queen Elizabeth's willingness to look beyond surface appearances and engage with someone whose public image seemed antithetical to royal values demonstrated the kind of leadership that would define her reign. For Ozzy himself, the recognition provided validation he had never expected to receive. More importantly, it gave him a platform to speak about mental health, addiction recovery, and the importance of accepting people who don't conform to conventional expectations. The relationship between Sir Ozzy and the Queen continued long after the ceremony. They exchanged Christmas cards annually, and he was occasionally invited to palace events celebrating British cultural achievements. These interactions always remained private, but palace staff reported that both parties seemed to genuinely enjoy their continued acquaintance. Years later, when asked about the experience, Ozzy would describe his time with Queen Elizabeth as life-changing. "She taught me that true nobility isn't about birth or background. It's about character, kindness, and the courage to see people for who they really are." The Queen, for her part, never publicly discussed the details of their meetings, but her decision to honor Ozzy Osbourne became widely regarded as one of her most insightful moments of leadership, demonstrating how traditional institutions could evolve and remain relevant without losing their essential character. The story of Ozzy Osbourne's knighthood represents more than just an unusual honor bestowed on an unlikely recipient. It illustrates the power of open-minded leadership, the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, and the possibility of finding common ground between seemingly incompatible worldviews. Queen Elizabeth's willingness to meet personally with someone whose public image suggested he was unsuitable for royal recognition demonstrated the kind of courageous judgment that defined her reign. Her decision to honor him despite widespread criticism showed how leaders can sometimes see potential that others miss. For Ozzy, the experience provided not just personal validation, but a deeper understanding of respect, tradition, and the responsibilities that come with public recognition. The encounter transformed him from someone who simply rebelled against authority into someone who understood how to work within systems to create positive change. Most importantly, their unlikely friendship proved that mutual respect and understanding can bridge any gap, no matter how wide it might initially appear. Sometimes, the most meaningful connections form between the most unexpected people, creating stories that inspire and surprise long after they occur. The legend of the Queen, who initially said, "This man doesn't belong in my country," but ultimately welcomed him into the highest ranks of British honor, remains one of the most remarkable examples of how preconceptions can be overcome through genuine human connection and open-minded leadership.